Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Marissa Kellerman, and 3 years ago I would have told you that the deepest part of human consciousness could be measured, categorized, and understood through empirical methodology. I spent 11 years at the Neurocognitive Research Institute in Burlington, Vermont, mapping the architecture of awareness itself. I believed that every mystery of the mind was simply a puzzle awaiting the correct configuration of technology and insight. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about many things. The Somnius Project came to my attention in February of 2022, though its roots extended decades further back into institutional memory that had been carefully obscured. I received the initial contact through my university email, a message so professionally mundane that I almost deleted it along with the pharmaceutical spam and conference invitations that cluttered my inbox daily. Dr. Richard Thale, whom I'd never heard of despite his supposed prominence in sleep research, wanted to discuss a consulting opportunity. The compensation figure he mentioned was substantial enough that I read the email twice, checking for the subtle grammatical errors that usually betrayed scam attempts. There were none. The address he provided led me to a building I'd passed hundreds of times without truly seeing. It occupied a corner lot on Industrial Avenue, where the commercial district surrendered to residential neighborhoods through a gradual decay of architectural ambition. The structure itself was aggressively nondescript, 4 stories of brown brick and tinted windows that reflected the overcast sky in sheets of uniform gray. No company name marked the entrance, only a street number in brushed steel digits. A small placard beside the door listed Somnius Foundation among a dozen other entities, all of which sounded vaguely medical without committing to any specific field. The lobby felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Clean, certainly. The tile floors gleamed with the particular sheen that suggested industrial cleaning solutions applied with obsessive regularity. But the furniture arrangement made no sense for a waiting area. The chairs faced away from the reception desk toward corners, creating isolated pockets of space that discouraged interaction. The magazines on the side tables were current issues, their spines uncreased, pages still crisp. Nobody had ever waited here long enough to need distraction. The receptionist, a woman whose age I couldn't determine beyond, professionally maintained middle years, checked her computer screen with the careful neutrality of someone trained to volunteer no information beyond what was explicitly required. She directed me to the 3rd floor without asking my name or purpose. The elevator arrived too quickly, its doors opening before I'd finished pressing the call button. Dr. Thale met me as the elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor, as if he'd been standing there waiting for that precise moment. He was younger than I'd expected, early 40s perhaps, with the kind of academic casual that required expensive taste to execute properly. His handshake was brief and dry, his eye contact maintained for exactly the socially appropriate duration. Everything about him existed within carefully calibrated parameters of professional normalcy. Dr. Kellerman, thank you for coming. His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, something European that had been worn smooth by decades in America. I hope the building wasn't difficult to find. We maintain a deliberately low profile here. The 3rd floor resembled a medical office crossed with a university laboratory. Examination rooms lined one corridor, their doors propped open to reveal standard medical furniture, examination tables with paper covers, blood pressure cuffs mounted on walls, eye charts. But the equipment I glimpsed in other rooms was more specialized. I recognized polysomnography machines, EEG arrays, neuroimaging devices that cost as much as small houses. Through one partially open door, I saw what appeared to be a sensory deprivation tank, its white surface gleaming under LED lights. Thale's office occupied a corner position with windows on two walls, though the tinted glass made the view feel more like suggestion than reality. The space was organized with the same unsettling precision as the lobby, every object positioned according to some logic I couldn't quite parse. Books lined the shelves in order of height rather than subject, creating a descending staircase pattern that hurt to look at for too long. "The Somnius Project," he began, settling into his chair with the careful positioning of someone who'd calculated the optimal ergonomic arrangement, "has been operating for 23 years under various institutional umbrellas. We study consciousness states that exist beyond conventional sleep architecture. I believe your work on neural oscillation patterns during REM atonia makes you uniquely qualified to consult on our current research phase." I should have asked more questions then, should have inquired about funding sources, institutional oversight, publication history. Instead, I found myself focusing on the way he'd phrased it: consciousness states beyond conventional sleep architecture. Every researcher in the field harbored secret dreams of discovering something genuinely novel, some aspect of human neurology that had escaped centuries of investigation. The possibility, however remote, created a gravity I couldn't resist. "What exactly are these consciousness states?" I asked. Thale touched a control on his desk, and one wall flickered to life as a display screen. Polysomnography readings appeared, the familiar wave patterns of brain activity, eye movement, muscle tone, all the standard measurements of sleep study. But there was something wrong with the data. The patterns didn't match any sleep stage I recognized. The brain waves showed characteristics of deep sleep, REM sleep, and waking consciousness simultaneously, oscillating between states at intervals that should have been physiologically impossible. "We call this the depth variance," Thale said, "a state of consciousness that appears to exist perpendicular to the standard sleep-wake axis. Subjects report experiences of extraordinary vividness, far exceeding typical dreams. They describe environments with consistent internal geography, populated by entities that maintain continuity across multiple sessions, and they bring something back with them." He advanced to the next slide. Brain scans now, showing neural activity patterns. The highlighted regions included areas associated with memory consolidation, spatial navigation, and, stranger still, regions involved in processing external sensory input, all active simultaneously during what should have been sleep. "Bring back what?" I asked. "Information. Verifiable data about things they couldn't possibly know. Subjects consistently demonstrate knowledge of events, locations, and facts entirely outside their previous experience. We've documented hundreds of instances where subjects' reports have been subsequently confirmed against external sources." I felt my skepticism engaging automatically, the trained response of someone who'd reviewed countless studies claiming extraordinary results from questionable methodology. That suggests either contamination of the experimental protocol or selective reporting of results. People make lucky guesses frequently. We're pattern recognition machines that sometimes see patterns where none exist. "I anticipated that response," Thale said, and his expression might have been amusement or something less readable. which is why I'd like you to participate as a subject first. Experience the depth variance yourself before reviewing our existing data. I find that personal experience provides context that no amount of statistical analysis can match. The proposal violated every principle of experimental design I'd been taught. Researchers don't make good subjects. We're too aware of experimental conditions, too prone to unconscious bias, too skilled at self-deception. And yet I found myself considering it. The compensation he'd mentioned would resolve 3 months of accumulated financial stress. More than that, though, the data had hooked something in my professional curiosity. If even a fraction of what he claimed was real, it represented a genuine discovery. "What does participation involve?" I asked, already knowing I would agree. The preparation took 3 days. They required medical screening first, blood work, cardiovascular assessment, neurological baseline measurements. The physician who conducted the examination, Dr. Helena Voss, had the same carefully neutral manner as everyone else I'd encountered in the building. She asked questions about my medical history with the mechanical thoroughness of someone following a protocol she'd executed hundreds of times, recording my answers without any visible reaction. "Any history of sleep disorders?" she asked. "Insomnia, sleep apnea, narcolepsy, parasomnia events?" "Occasional difficulty falling asleep during periods of stress," I said. "Nothing clinical." "Psychiatric history? Depression, anxiety, psychotic episodes, dissociative symptoms?" "No. I didn't mention the professional therapy I'd engaged in during graduate school. That fell within normal parameters of academic stress management." "Substance use, current medications?" I listed the minimal inventory of my medicine cabinet: antihistamines for allergies, ibuprofen for headaches, multivitamins I took irregularly. She recorded each item with the same level of attention she'd given to every other response. The actual procedure was scheduled for the following Monday. They asked me to maintain a regular sleep schedule in the interim, avoid alcohol and caffeine for 48 hours prior, abstain from any medications beyond those I'd listed. I received an information packet that detailed the procedure with the careful vagueness of documents designed to satisfy legal requirements without providing useful specificity. There would be monitoring equipment, a specialized audio protocol, supervision by trained staff throughout. Any time I wished to discontinue, I could simply remove the monitoring equipment and the session would end. I signed the consent forms on Monday morning, with the bright winter sun cutting through Thales' office windows in parallelograms that didn't quite align with the furniture arrangement. My hand was steadier than I expected. Whatever doubts I'd accumulated over the intervening days had been overwritten by professional curiosity, and the check that would deposit into my account upon completion of the initial session. The chamber where they conducted the sessions occupied the 4th floor in a space that had clearly been purpose-built. The walls were lined with acoustic foam in a pattern that swallowed sound completely. When the door closed behind me, the silence became something physical, a pressure against my eardrums that made me aware of my own pulse. The lighting came from sources I couldn't identify, creating a uniform illumination that eliminated shadows entirely. At the room's center was something between a bed and a medical table, cushioned and adjustable, surrounded by monitoring equipment that hummed with the particular white noise of expensive electronics. Dr. Voss was present, along with 2 technicians whose names I immediately forgot. They positioned me on the table with gentle efficiency, attaching the familiar apparatus of polysomnography, electrodes to my scalp for EEG measurements, sensors near my eyes to track movement, a pulse oximeter on my finger. But they added additional equipment I didn't recognize. Small contact points were placed at my temples, behind my ears, at the base of my skull where the spine met the brainstem. These connected to a device that looked like a modified transcranial magnetic stimulation unit, though the configuration was unlike any TMS apparatus I'd seen. The audio protocol will begin once you're relaxed, Voss explained. You'll hear tones at specific frequencies designed to facilitate entry into the depth variance state. Don't try to analyze or resist them. Just let yourself respond naturally. The state usually establishes within 15 to 20 minutes. Once achieved, you'll remain in it for approximately 90 minutes. We'll monitor continuously and can intervene if any parameters fall outside acceptable ranges. What should I expect to experience? I asked. Her expression did something complicated, settling into what might have been sympathy or possibly warning. Everyone's first session is different. The environment you encounter will be constructed from your own neural architecture, filtered through the depth variance interface. Trust that you're safe. Trust that we can extract you if necessary. Don't trust anything you meet there. That final instruction lingered in my mind as the lights dimmed to a level that suggested twilight rather than darkness. The audio began, not music exactly, but tones that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. Low frequencies I felt in my chest cavity, higher tones that made my teeth ache, all of it cycling through patterns that suggested structure without revealing it. I tried to analyze the acoustic properties, to identify the specific frequencies being employed, but my focus kept sliding away like oil on water. My breathing deepened automatically. I felt my body relaxing in stages, muscle groups releasing tension in sequence from my feet upward. The monitoring equipment tracked my descent towards sleep with soft sounds that integrated into the audio pattern. The room's temperature felt perfectly calibrated, cool enough to prevent discomfort, warm enough to encourage rest. Every element had been optimized for this single purpose. The transition happened without a clear boundary. One moment I was lying on the table analyzing my own responses. The next I was standing in a corridor that had no relationship to the building I'd entered. The shift felt like the jump cuts in dreams, where location changes occur without the transit between them. But this wasn't a dream. Every sensation possessed the concrete specificity of waking experience. The floor beneath my feet was smooth concrete, slightly cool through the thin socks I was still wearing. The air carried smells I could identify. Industrial cleaning solution, old paper, something organic and faintly unpleasant beneath the chemical overlay. The corridor extended in both directions further than I could see, lit by fluorescent fixtures that created pools of harsh white light, separated by intervals of relative darkness. Doors lined both walls at irregular intervals, their paint the institutional green that suggested government buildings or hospitals. Some stood open, revealing rooms that made no architectural sense. Through one door, I saw what appeared to be a Victorian parlor, complete with floral wallpaper and furniture upholstered in crushed velvet. Through another, a concrete stairwell descended into darkness. A third opened onto what looked like a forest, trees visible in the narrow frame of the doorway. I knew this was the depth variance state. The knowledge existed separate from rational assessment, absolute and immediate. I was simultaneously aware that I was lying on a table in a monitored room and standing in this impossible corridor. Both experiences were equally real, equally present. The cognitive dissonance this should have created simply didn't materialize. My mind accommodated both realities without apparent effort. I chose a direction arbitrarily and began walking. My footsteps echoed despite the acoustic dampening properties the corridor's material should have possessed. The doors I passed revealed increasingly nonsensical spaces: a beach at sunset, a server room with endless racks of blinking equipment, a child's bedroom frozen in amber light. None of the doorways showed me entering the rooms. They were display windows only, offering glimpses of places that couldn't coexist in any physical structure. The first entity I encountered was sitting on the floor approximately 50 feet ahead, positioned in one of the darker intervals between light fixtures. It resembled a human figure in the same way a child's drawing resembles a photograph. All the essential elements present, but assembled according to logic that didn't quite align with reality. Its proportions were subtly wrong: limbs a bit too long, head canted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for an actual person. It was wearing what might have been a business suit, dark fabric that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. As I approached, it looked up. Its face was the most disturbing aspect, features that shifted slightly whenever I tried to focus on them, as if they existed in constant flux between several possible configurations. Eyes, nose, mouth, all present but refusing to stabilize into a coherent expression. "You're new," it said. The voice emerged from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me rather than emanating from the figure. "First session." I should have felt fear. Every survival instinct should have been screaming warnings about this wrongness, this violation of natural law. Instead, I felt a detached curiosity, as if I were observing someone else's encounter. "Yes," I replied. "What are you?" "Resident," it said. "Permanent fixture. Some of us stay. The corridor keeps us. Feeds on us, maybe, or we feed on it. The relationship isn't entirely clear. You'll leave when your time expires. We don't have that option anymore." "How long have you been here?" The figure did something that might have been a laugh or possibly a cough. Time doesn't work correctly in the variance. Could be years. Could be days. Could be that I've always been here and the memory of being somewhere else is the aberration. "Are you a subject or a researcher?" "Both," I said. "I'm consulting on the project." "Ah." It stood with a motion that involved too many joints bending in too many directions. "Then you should know they're not telling you everything. The depth variance isn't just a consciousness state. It's a place, real as anywhere else, just running on different rules. And it's growing. Every session expands it. Every subject who enters contributes to its architecture. What starts as individual neural structures gets incorporated into the collective geography. Your memories, your fears, your desires, they all become rooms in the infinite building." I processed this claim with the strange clarity the depth variance provided. That's not possible. This is a neurological phenomenon, a synchronized state across multiple brain regions that creates the illusion of shared experience. "Keep telling yourself that," the figure said. It was already retreating backward, sliding into the shadows between lights. "But when you find the archive, remember I warned you. Some information doesn't want to be known. Some doors shouldn't be opened. And some of us who are trapped here used to believe exactly what you believe now." It dissolved into the darkness, and I was alone in the corridor again. I continued walking because stopping felt worse. The doors I passed now showed increasingly specific scenes. A laboratory very similar to the one I'd worked in during my postdoctoral research. An apartment that resembled one I'd lived in a decade ago. A classroom from my undergraduate years. The variance was pulling from my memories, assembling its geography from my neural architecture exactly as Voss had described. But there were other doors showing places I'd never been. A hospital room where someone old and frail was dying surrounded by machines. A basement full of filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open to reveal papers covered in text I couldn't read. A rooftop at night with a city sprawling below, lights creating constellations that didn't match any actual urban landscape. These came from somewhere else, some other source feeding into the collective structure. I don't know how long I walked. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, creating new sections as I progressed. The lighting remained constant, that alternating pattern of harsh illumination and relative darkness. My body felt present and absent simultaneously. I was aware of walking, of the physical sensation of movement, but also of lying still on the monitoring table. Both states existed in parallel, neither dominant. The archive appeared without warning, a set of double doors that were fundamentally different from the others. They were wooden, heavy, carved with patterns that might have been text or decoration or some hybrid of both. They stood slightly open, revealing darkness beyond. A sign above the doorway read "Archive of External Knowledge" in brass letters that gleamed despite the fluorescent lighting. I understood immediately that entering would be significant, that whatever lay beyond those doors represented a boundary of some kind, a line between the merely strange and something more fundamental. The resident's warning echoed in my memory. Some information doesn't want to be known. But I was a researcher. Curiosity was my professional obligation. I pushed the doors open and stepped through. The space beyond was impossible. It extended upward and outward further than any structure could contain. A library that would have required a building the size of multiple city blocks. Shelves rose toward a ceiling I couldn't see, accessed by ladders and catwalks and staircases that connected at angles that violated Euclidean geometry. The lighting came from sources that moved, illuminated sections drifting like spotlights operated by unseen technicians. But the shelves didn't hold books. They held moments, crystallized instances of experience preserved in forms I couldn't quite identify. Some resembled photographs, others video displays, still others existed as pure light or sound or sensation. I approached the nearest shelf and saw fragments of lives I'd never lived. A child's birthday party with a cake shaped like a train. A car accident captured in the instant before impact. A wedding ceremony in a language I didn't speak. Thousands of moments, millions perhaps, all archived with meticulous organization according to principles I couldn't decipher. A figure emerged from between the shelves, more stable than the resident I'd encountered earlier. This one had features that held their shape. A woman, perhaps in her 60s, wearing what might have been a librarian's cardigan over a dress that was decades out of fashion. Her eyes were the strangest element, possessing a depth that suggested they extended further back into her skull than anatomy should allow. "Dr. Kellerman," she said, and somehow I knew she would know my name. "Welcome to the archive. You're earlier than expected. Most subjects don't find this section until their third or fourth session. But you're different, aren't you? You're one of the ones who asks questions." "What is this place?" I asked. Exactly what the sign indicates. External knowledge, information that exists beyond individual neural experience. Every fact that every subject has ever learned, every memory they've contributed to the variance, all compiled and cross-referenced. The depth variance doesn't just access your memories. It collects them, integrates them, makes them available to the entire system. You came in with 11 years of neuroscience training. That knowledge is now part of the archive. Anyone who enters the variance can potentially access it. I felt something cold settling in my chest, a recognition of implications I didn't want to examine too closely. That's not how consciousness works. Memories are encoded in specific neural structures. They can't be extracted and transferred. Can't they? She gestured to the shelves around us. You're experiencing this conversation. You're seeing this place. Your brain is generating the sensory experience from signals produced by Thales equipment, interpreted through your neural architecture, manifested as this interaction. If your brain can create all this from electromagnetic stimulation, why couldn't it also transmit information outward? The variance is bidirectional, Dr. Kellerman. It receives and it sends. Every session, every subject, contributes to the collective knowledge base, and every subject can potentially access what others have contributed. That would require some form of, I struggled for the term, external storage. The information would need to exist somewhere outside individual brains. Yes, she agreed, it would, and yet here we are, surrounded by precisely that. The variance isn't occurring in your brain, doctor. Your brain is merely the interface. The depth variance is a place, a genuine location that exists in relationship to consciousness the way physical space exists in relationship to matter. And it's been here much longer than 23 years. She moved deeper into the archive, and I followed because remaining stationary felt like surrendering to the implications of what she'd said. The shelves continued endlessly, their contents becoming more abstract the further we progressed. I saw mathematical equations that seemed to solve themselves as I watched, their variables rearranging into new configurations. Historical documents describing events that had never occurred or hadn't occurred yet. The distinction seemed meaningless here. Scientific discoveries that would require technology we hadn't invented, philosophical treatises in languages that might not be human in origin. The Somnius Project didn't create the variance, the archivist continued. They discovered it, found a way to access something that's always existed adjacent to human consciousness. Every person who sleeps touches the variance peripherally. That's where dreams come from, brief contacts with this deeper layer of reality. But Thales technology allows sustained, conscious access. It lets subjects move through the variance with intention rather than drifting randomly. And every time someone does, the variance grows stronger, more substantial, more capable of influencing the waking world. What do you mean, influencing the waking world? She stopped walking and turned to face me with an expression that might have been pity. Information doesn't stay contained. Dr. Knowledge learned in the variance persists after subjects wake. Skills practiced here transfer to physical performance. Languages acquired in the archive become accessible in conscious life. The boundary between the variance and reality is permeable. What happens here echoes outward. And as more subjects participate, as the variance grows more complex and populated, those echoes intensify. I was trying to process this when the archivist's form began to flicker, her features destabilizing like a video signal losing coherence. The archive itself started to fade, the shelves becoming translucent, the impossible geometry revealing normal space behind it like a stage set being struck. Your session is ending, the archivist said, her voice already distant. They're extracting you, but you'll be back. They always bring the consultants back multiple times, and each return you'll go deeper, understand more, become more integrated with the variance architecture. Eventually, you might not leave at all. Some subjects stay voluntarily, some have no choice. The variance decides. The transition back was more violent than the entry had been. I felt myself pulled through space that had no distance, compressed and expanded simultaneously, every sense overloaded with information that exceeded processing capacity. Then I was gasping on the monitoring table, the familiar weight of physical embodiment settling over me like a too heavy blanket. Dr. Voss was leaning over me, her expression professionally concerned. Elevated heart rate and blood pressure, but within acceptable parameters. How do you feel? I tried to answer, but my vocal cords wouldn't coordinate properly at first. When I finally managed speech, my voice came out hoarse. Disoriented, that was, I need water. One of the technicians provided a cup, and I drank it slowly, feeling the cold liquid trace a path down my throat and into my stomach. The sensation felt excessive, too vivid, as if my nervous system was still calibrated for the variance's intensity. Your session lasted 92 minutes, Voss said, checking her tablet. Neural activity was consistent with established depth variance patterns. Did you encounter any entities or structures? Yes, a resident in the corridor, and the archive. I described both encounters while the memories were still sharp, though I could feel them already beginning to fade the way dreams fade, leaving impressions without clear details. Voss recorded my report without visible reaction, typing notes on her tablet with mechanical efficiency. When I finished, she looked up with an expression I couldn't interpret. The archive. That's significant. Most subjects don't access that section until much later in the protocol. Dr. Thale will want to debrief you directly. The meeting with Thale occurred the following morning in his office. I'd spent the intervening hours at home, trying to reconcile the experience with everything I understood about neuroscience. The depth variance couldn't be what the archivist had described. It had to be some form of shared hallucination, a synchronized state induced by the audio protocols and electromagnetic stimulation. The feeling of encountering real places and entities was compelling, but feelings weren't evidence. Yet I couldn't dismiss what I'd experienced entirely. The archive had felt absolutely real, with a consistency and coherence that exceeded typical dreams. And the information the archivist had provided was too sophisticated, too specific to be random neural noise. Either I'd generated an extraordinarily detailed fantasy, or something stranger was occurring. Thale listened to my description of the session with the focused attention of someone assessing data rather than hearing a story. He asked specific questions about the corridor's architecture, the residents' appearance, the archive's organization. He seemed particularly interested in what the archivist had told me about the variance's nature and history. She told you the variance predates the Somnius project, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she claimed you discovered it rather than created it. That humans have always had peripheral access during normal sleep. The entities in the variance say many things, Thale replied. Determining which statements reflect actual information versus constructed narrative is challenging, but there's evidence supporting that particular claim. Historical records contain descriptions of states that match depth variance characteristics, medieval mystical experiences, shamanic journeys, certain forms of meditation-induced trance, all potentially describing the same underlying phenomenon accessed through different methodologies. But you're suggesting it's real, I said. Not just a neurological state, but an actual place. Thale made a gesture that might have been agreement or perhaps something more complicated. The distinction between neurological states and external reality may not be as clear as we typically assume. Consciousness is always mediated by neural processes. Every experience you have occurs inside your brain, constructed from sensory input and memory and prediction. The question isn't whether the variance is real in some absolute sense, but whether it possesses consistency, persistence, and shared accessibility across multiple observers. By those criteria, it appears to be as real as anything else we consider objective. He pulled up data on his display, brain scans from multiple subjects, all showing similar patterns during depth variance sessions. The synchronization was remarkable neural activity aligning across individuals who had never met, who were participating in sessions separated by days or weeks, as if they were all tuning into the same external signal. What we've discovered, Thale continued, is that consciousness may not be entirely generated by individual brains. The brain might function more like a receiver, tuning into fields of information that exist independent of any single person. The variance represents one of those fields, perhaps the primary one, the substrate from which individual consciousness emerges. When we access it deliberately, we're not creating hallucinations. We're expanding our perceptual range to include layers of reality normally filtered out. I wanted to reject this interpretation. It violated fundamental principles of neuroscience, suggested a metaphysics that science had supposedly moved beyond. But the data was compelling, and my own experience had felt nothing like hallucination. I'd been in that corridor, in that archive. I'd interacted with entities that possessed intelligence and intention beyond what random neural activity should produce. "What's the purpose of the project?" I asked. "If you've discovered this variant state, what are you trying to achieve?" Thale's expression did something subtle, shifting from professional neutrality towards something that might have been excitement or possibly concern. "We're mapping it, documenting its geography, cataloging the entities, understanding its principles. The variance is vast, Doctor. What you encountered in 90 minutes represents a microscopic fraction of its extent. There are regions we've barely explored, structures that appear to have been built by intelligences we haven't encountered. And all of it connects back to human consciousness somehow. Understanding the variance means understanding ourselves at a fundamental level. And the entities, the residents and the archivist, where do they come from? That's one of the central mysteries. Some may be generated by the collective unconscious of all subjects who have participated, psychological constructs given form by the variance's reality-shaping properties. Others might be," he paused, choosing words carefully, "indigenous, intelligences that existed in the variance before humans learned to access it consciously. We don't know yet. That's part of what we're trying to determine." He offered me a more extensive consulting contract, multiple sessions as subject, followed by analysis of other subjects' data, contribution to theoretical frameworks. The compensation was generous enough to resolve all my immediate financial concerns. But there was something else driving my consideration beyond money. I'd experienced something genuinely unprecedented. Walking away now would mean abandoning the most significant discovery I'd ever encountered. I signed the extended contract that afternoon. The second session occurred 3 days later, following the same preparation protocol. My body remembered the procedure, relaxing into the monitoring equipment with practiced ease. The audio protocol began, those impossible tones that bypassed normal auditory processing. This time I recognized the transition point, felt the moment when my consciousness shifted from the physical room to the variance corridor. I materialized in the same location as before, or what appeared to be the same location. The architecture was identical, that endless hallway with its doors opening onto impossible spaces. But something felt different. The air had a quality I hadn't noticed previously, a thickness that suggested atmosphere rather than vacuum, and the doors were different. While many showed spaces I recognized from my previous session, others had changed, their contents rearranged or replaced entirely. The resident appeared more quickly this time, emerging from a doorway about 30 feet ahead. It was different from the one I'd encountered before. This figure was smaller, its proportions suggesting a child despite features that refused to stabilize into any recognizable age. It was holding what might have been a toy or possibly a tool, something that shifted between interpretations as I tried to focus on it. "Second session," it observed. "You came back. Not everyone does after they meet the archivist. The information she provides tends to discourage participation." "I'm a researcher," I said. "Information doesn't frighten me." "No." The child resident moved closer, and I noticed its movements had a quality like stop-motion animation, existing in discrete positions rather than flowing continuously. "Then you're braver than most or less imaginative than necessary. The Variance loves researchers. You ask questions that help it expand. Every inquiry opens new sections, creates additional architecture. By investigating it, you strengthen it." "That's not how observation works," I replied. "Studying a phenomenon doesn't change its fundamental nature." The resident did its disturbing approximation of laughter, spoken like someone who never heard of quantum mechanics, or who forgot that consciousness isn't passive. "You're not observing the variance from outside. You're inside it, part of it, changing it by your presence. The corridor you're walking right now didn't exist before the Somnius project began. Every hallway, every door, every space beyond those doors, all built from subjects' neural architecture. You're not exploring a place, Doctor. You're constructing it in real time while simultaneously experiencing it. Creator and observer both." Before I could respond, the figure flickered and vanished, leaving me alone with implications I didn't want to examine. I continued deeper into the corridor, passing doors that showed increasingly disturbing scenes. A room filled with mirrors reflecting versions of myself that were subtly wrong clothes, wrong expressions, wrong ages. A stairwell that descended into depths where the darkness seemed to have texture and weight. A laboratory where experiments were being conducted on subjects I couldn't quite see clearly, their forms blurred beyond recognition. The archive doors appeared again, but their position had changed. They were no longer a single set of doors, but multiple entrances scattered throughout the corridor, each leading to different sections of the vast library. I chose one arbitrarily and entered. This section of the archive was different from what I'd seen before. The shelves here held what appeared to be case files, thick folders bound with string, their covers labeled with alphanumeric codes. I pulled one randomly and opened it. Inside were documents describing a subject named Thomas Harwick, a volunteer in the Somnius project who had participated in 17 sessions over a 6-month period. The files included his background, his reported experiences, his changing neural patterns. The final entry was marked permanent resident status, voluntary transfer. I felt cold despite the archive's neutral temperature. Voluntary transfer to where? "To here," a voice said behind me. I turned to find a man who looked like his photograph in the file, middle-aged, slightly overweight, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Thomas," or "I was Thomas." Now I'm more accurately described as a former subject who chose to remain in the variance permanently rather than continue cycling between states. That's not possible, I said. You're a construct, a representation generated by. By what? Thomas interrupted. My own brain. I don't have a brain anymore, not in the conventional sense. My physical body died 6 weeks after my transfer. Natural causes, apparently, though the timing was suspicious. But I continued existing here, which suggests consciousness doesn't require meat to persist. The variance preserves us somehow, maintains our patterns independent of biological substrate. He moved through the archive with casual familiarity, pulling files and reshelved them with the careful attention of someone performing a task they've done countless times. I was a mathematician in the waking world. Number theory, abstract stuff with no practical applications. But here I can work on problems that would take physical human centuries to solve. The archive contains all the mathematical knowledge every subject has ever contributed. I can access insights from minds more brilliant than mine ever was, synthesize approaches that no single person could develop alone. It's paradise for someone like me. But you're dead, I said. Am I? He gestured at himself at the archive around us. I think, therefore I am. I experience, I learn, I interact with others. What's the functional difference between this existence and what you call being alive? You're so certain your consciousness is generated by your brain, but what if it's the opposite? What if your brain is just filtering and limiting consciousness that already exists in substrates like the variance? Death of the body might just mean loss of that filtering mechanism, allowing the consciousness to exist here in its natural state. I wanted to argue, but the philosophical ground was less stable than I'd expected. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience emerges from physical processes, remained unsolved despite centuries of investigation. And standing in this impossible library, having a conversation with a man who claimed to be dead, the materialist assumptions I'd built my career on felt suddenly inadequate. The Somnius Project knows about you, I said, holding up his file. They're documenting permanent residence. Of course they know. They facilitate the transfers for subjects who request them. Not many do. Most people have attachments to the physical world that outweigh the variance's attractions. But some of us find this existence preferable. No aging, no disease, no biological needs. Just consciousness engaging with information in its purest form. Thale offers it as an option once subjects reach a certain level of integration. Integration. The more sessions you complete, the more your neural patterns synchronize with the variance architecture. Eventually, the boundary between you and this place becomes permeable enough that transitioning is possible. You're probably 3 or 4 sessions away from that threshold. They'll offer you the choice soon. I felt something tightening in my chest, an anxiety response my body was generating despite the variance's usual dampening of strong emotions. I don't want that. I'm here to study the phenomenon, not become part of it. Thomas's expression shifted toward what might have been sympathy. That's what we all said initially, but the variance changes you. Every session integrates you further, makes the waking world feel increasingly foreign and uncomfortable. Your neural patterns are being restructured to accommodate variance architecture. Eventually, your brain will be more adapted to this environment than to physical reality. The transition becomes inevitable, whether you actively choose it or simply fail to resist. He pulled another file from the shelves, this one labeled with my name. You're an interesting case. Most subjects who reach the archive this quickly are psychologically unstable or highly suggestible. But your psychological profiles suggest neither. You're reaching deeper sections faster than anticipated because you're asking the right questions, pursuing lines of inquiry that align with the variance's structure. It's responding to your curiosity by revealing itself more completely. The file contained information about me that I'd never disclosed to anyone at the Somnius Project. Childhood memories, professional failures, relationship histories I deliberately kept private. Seeing my life reduced to documented data points created a violation feeling that exceeded normal privacy concerns. This was cognitive invasion, a breach of mental autonomy I hadn't consented to. "How did you get this information?" I demanded. "I didn't get it, you brought it. Every memory you've ever formed exists in your neural architecture. When you enter the variance, that entire memory structure becomes accessible to the archive. We don't extract it deliberately. It simply becomes available, integrated into the collective knowledge base. By the end of your contract, everything you've ever known or experienced will be documented here. That's the cost of participation, complete transparency of consciousness." I wanted to leave immediately, to terminate the session and never return. But I couldn't determine how to exit deliberately. The extraction had happened to me during my first session, initiated by the technicians monitoring my physical body. I had no idea how to trigger it myself from inside the variance. "Looking for the exit?" Thomas asked. "There isn't one you can access directly. The variance keeps you here until your session duration expires or your physical body experiences distress sufficient to trigger automatic extraction. Trying to force yourself awake is possible but extremely unpleasant. It creates a tearing sensation, consciousness fragmenting across multiple states simultaneously. Most subjects wait out their scheduled time rather than risk that." I checked my internal sense of duration, trying to estimate how long I'd been in the variance. Time felt elastic here, stretching and compressing unpredictably. What felt like 30 minutes might have been 3 hours or 3 minutes. There was no way to know. Thomas returned his file and mine to their positions on the shelves with careful precision. "You're frightened. That's reasonable, but you'll come back. The variance has hooks in you now. You'll dream about it between sessions, find yourself distracted during waking hours by memories of being here. That's the early stage of integration. Your consciousness is learning to exist in two states simultaneously, and increasingly, this state will feel more natural than embodied existence." "That's just psychological suggestion," I said. "You're describing a process that could be explained by expectation effects and confirmation bias." "Believe whatever helps you sleep," Thomas replied. "But pay attention to your dreams tonight. Notice how they've changed. The variance leaks. What you experience here influences what you experience there, and vice versa. The boundary is collapsing for you, Doctor, has been since your first session. There's no reversing it now." He walked away deeper into the archive, and I didn't follow. Instead, I explored other sections, finding files on hundreds of subjects, documenting thousands of sessions. The scope was overwhelming. The Somnius Project had been operating on a far larger scale than Thale had indicated, and the permanent resident files kept appearing. Dozens of people who had transferred fully into the variance, their physical bodies presumably dead or catatonic while their consciousness persisted here. I found a section labeled Adverse Events, and opened it despite something in my gut telling me I shouldn't. The files documented subjects who had experienced severe psychological trauma during sessions, psychotic breaks, dissociative disorders, complete personality fragmentation. Several had required psychiatric hospitalization. 3 had died, 1 suicide, 2 from causes listed as unexplained cardiac events that occurred during sessions. The session ended while I was reading these files, the extraction happening with the same violent disorientation as before. I gasped back into my body with my heart racing at dangerous speeds, the monitoring equipment shrieking alarms that brought Voss and the technicians rushing to my side. Elevated heart rate, blood pressure critically high, signs of acute stress response, Voss said, her professional composure finally cracking slightly. What happened? The archive I managed. Files on adverse events, deaths. Her expression froze. You shouldn't have been able to access that section. It's restricted, not part of the standard variance geography subjects can reach. Then your restrictions aren't working. I saw everything. The permanent residents, the subjects who died or went insane. You're not monitoring for safety, you're documenting casualties. Voss exchanged glances with the technicians, some unspoken communication passing between them. Dr. Thale needs to be informed immediately. Dr. Kellerman, I need you to remain here while we... No, I was already pulling off the monitoring equipment, electrodes tearing away from my skin, leaving small stinging points. I'm done. I'm terminating my participation in the project effective immediately. You signed a contract, Voss said. I signed consent forms that indicated I could withdraw at any time. I'm withdrawing, now. I left the building despite their protests, despite Voss following me down the stairwell insisting that abruptly terminating participation could cause severe psychological consequences. I didn't care. Whatever the variance was, it represented a danger I hadn't comprehended when I agreed to participate. The permanent residents, the casualties, the systematic documentation of consciousness violation, all of it added up to something profoundly wrong. But Thomas had been right about one thing. That night, my dreams were different. I found myself back in the variance corridor, walking past those doors with their impossible contents. Except this wasn't a session. I was asleep in my apartment, my body in my bed, but my consciousness was navigating variance architecture as clearly as if I'd been on Thale's monitoring table. The resident appeared, the original one I'd encountered in my first session. You can't leave, it said. Not completely. The variance has established connections in your neural structure. You'll come back here every time you sleep now, whether you want to or not. That's what integration means. I tried to wake myself deliberately, concentrating on my physical body, but the usual mechanisms of lucid dreaming didn't work. I remained locked in the variance corridor, unable to extract myself through will alone. You're realizing the problem, the resident continued. The Somnius Project doesn't tell subjects that participation is permanent. The moment you complete your first session, you're part of the variance forever. Your consciousness has been marked, tagged, integrated into the architecture. Waking and sleeping become increasingly meaningless distinctions. Eventually, you'll exist primarily here and only temporarily there. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, and I understood with terrible clarity that I was trapped. Not in this specific dream, perhaps. I would wake eventually when my sleep cycle completed. But I would return here every night, pulled back into the variance architecture whether I consented or not. Thale's technology hadn't given me temporary access to an altered state. It had permanently altered my consciousness, changing the fundamental structure of how my mind interfaced with reality. I woke gasping in my apartment, tangled in sheets soaked with sweat. The clock showed 3, 12:47 a.m. I'd been asleep for less than 2 hours but felt exhausted, as if I'd been engaged in strenuous activity. My head ached with a quality I'd never experienced before, not pain exactly, but a sense of wrongness, of structures that shouldn't exist taking up space in my skull. I tried to return to sleep but couldn't. Every time I approached unconsciousness, I felt the pull of the variance, that corridor waiting to materialize around me. The boundary between sleep and variance had collapsed. They were synonymous now. The next 3 days were exercises in sleep deprivation. I consumed dangerous amounts of caffeine, used every technique I knew to maintain wakefulness, but eventually biology demanded rest. When I finally collapsed into unwilling unconsciousness, the variance was waiting. And this time, I encountered something new. The corridor had changed. Doors that had shown specific spaces now opened onto what I can only describe as procedural generation. Rooms that assembled themselves as I watched, pulling from some vast database of architectural possibilities. The variance was growing, expanding, creating new geography in real time. And I understood with a clarity that bypassed rational analysis that my presence was fueling this expansion. My neural activity, my consciousness engaging with the variance, provided energy or information or something else it needed to proliferate. The archivist found me in one of these newly generated spaces, a library that was somehow different from the archive but served a similar function. "You're resisting," she observed. "Trying to limit your exposure. That won't work. The integration process is irreversible. Fighting it only causes psychological damage." "I don't consent to this," I said. "I want my consciousness back under my control." "It never was entirely under your control. Consciousness is porous, Doctor. It's always been influenced by external information, shaped by culture and language and the accumulated knowledge of our species. The variance just makes that process explicit and bidirectional. What you're experiencing now is what every human being has always experienced, just consciously rather than unconsciously." That's sophistry. There's a difference between cultural influence and having my memories extracted and archived without permission. The archivist's expression was difficult to read, something between sympathy and indifference. Permission is a concept from the embodied world where individuals are discrete units with clear boundaries. The variance operates differently. Here, consciousness is continuous, flowing between entities without clear separation. Information isn't owned. It simply exists, accessible to anyone who reaches the appropriate sections of the archive. You're clinging to individualist notions of mental autonomy that aren't applicable in this environment. She led me deeper into this new library space, showing me sections I hadn't encountered before. Files on historical figures whose consciousness had supposedly been accessed through the variance. Da Vinci, Tesla, Einstein, dozens of others. According to the documentation, fragments of their neural patterns persisted in the variance somehow, their knowledge accessible to subjects who knew how to navigate to the right locations. "This is impossible," I said. "These people died decades or centuries ago. Their brains decomposed. There's nothing to persist." "Brains are substrate," the archivist replied. "Consciousness is pattern. If the pattern can be preserved independent of the substrate, then consciousness can persist after biological death. The variance appears to function as that preserving medium. We don't understand the mechanism, some quantum effect perhaps, or something even stranger, but the evidence is undeniable. We can access information these individuals possessed. Information not recorded anywhere in the physical world. Information that proves correct when verified against later discoveries. She showed me examples, Tesla's specifications for devices he never built, verified decades later by independent engineers. Einstein's preliminary work on theories he never published, confirmed by subsequent research. Da Vinci's anatomical observations that exceeded what Renaissance science should have been capable of understanding. All documented in the archive, all apparently extracted from consciousness patterns that had somehow survived bodily death. If true, the implications were staggering, not just for neuroscience but for metaphysics, for our understanding of what consciousness was and how it related to physical reality. The variance would represent proof of something philosophy had debated for millennia. That mind was fundamental, that consciousness could exist independent of matter. But the cost of this discovery was becoming clear to me. The Somnius project wasn't just studying the variance. It was feeding it, expanding it, using subjects to strengthen and elaborate its architecture. Every session added to the collective knowledge base, made the variance more robust and persistent. And subjects like me, who got deeply integrated, became permanent nodes in the network, our consciousness partially or fully transferred into this space. What happens to my body? I asked. If I continue sessions, if I become fully integrated, does my physical body die? Sometimes, the archivist admitted. Full transfer often results in biological death, though the causative mechanism isn't understood. But some permanent residents maintain their bodies in vegetative states for years, kept alive by medical intervention while their consciousness exists entirely in the variance. A few even manage partial integration, cycling between states, existing in both worlds simultaneously, though never completely in either. That's horrifying. Is it, or is it evolution? Consciousness learning to exist in new substrates, freeing itself from biological limitations. Your species is on the threshold of something unprecedented. The variance offers existence without aging, disease, physical vulnerability. Pure consciousness engaging with pure information. Many would consider that transcendence, not horror. The session ended while she was speaking, pulling me back to waking with the usual disorientation. But I brought something with me this time, a mathematical equation I'd seen in one of Tesla's files, an elegant solution to a problem in electromagnetic theory that had troubled me during my undergraduate studies. I hadn't known the solution when I entered the variance. Now I did, complete and perfect in my memory. I tested the equation, working through its implications. It was correct. More than correct, it was brilliant, solving the problem in ways I never would have conceived independently. I had accessed genuine information from the variance, knowledge that existed outside my own neural architecture. The reality of what was happening became undeniable. The variance was real. Not just a neurological phenomenon, but an actual place, a dimension of reality that my consciousness could access. And I'd been permanently integrated into it, my mind now existing partially in both worlds simultaneously. I called Thale that afternoon, requesting a meeting. He agreed without hesitation, as if he'd been expecting my call. We met in his office the following morning, the same space where he'd first described the project. But it looked different now, wrong somehow. The books arranged by height bothered me more than before. The windows with their tinted glass felt like barriers against reality rather than transparent boundaries. You've been accessing the variance through normal sleep, Thale said before I could speak. It wasn't a question. Yes, I can't stop it. Every time I sleep, I'm pulled back there. That's expected for someone at your integration level. The variance has established permanent neural pathways. Those connections are now as much a part of your brain architecture as any other neural structure. You didn't warn me this would happen. You let me consent to participation without explaining that it was permanent. Thale's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested careful positioning. Would you have participated if I'd explained the complete process up front? Most people wouldn't. They conceptualize consciousness as something they own, something private and contained. The reality is far more complex. Consciousness has always been networked, collective, influenced by external sources. The variance just makes that networking explicit and functional. You're violating people's mental autonomy. We're expanding it, Thale corrected, giving subjects access to knowledge and experiences beyond what their individual brains could generate. Yes, that expansion comes with loss of previous boundaries, but evolution always involves trading old limitations for new capabilities. You've already experienced the benefits. You accessed information from the variance that your individual consciousness didn't possess. That's cognitive enhancement, beyond what any pharmaceutical or technological intervention could provide. I wanted to argue, but he had a point. I'd gained knowledge I didn't have before, knowledge that was genuinely useful, and the temptation to access more was strong. The archive contained the accumulated knowledge of thousands of subjects, spanning decades of sessions. What could I learn if I explored it systematically? What insights could I gain? That's the hook, Thale said, reading my expression accurately. The variance offers what every researcher dreams of: unlimited access to information, the ability to learn anything, to solve problems by drawing on collective intelligence that exceeds any individual capability. Once you've experienced that, returning to the limitations of individual consciousness feels like accepting blindness after having sight. But people are dying. I saw the adverse events files. Subjects who had psychotic breaks or cardiac events or committed suicide after participation. There are always casualties in revolutionary research, Thale said without apparent emotion. Pharmaceutical trials have adverse events. Surgical innovations require failed attempts before achieving success. The variance represents something far more significant than a new drug or procedure. It's a fundamental expansion of human consciousness. Some subjects can't tolerate that expansion. Their neural structures are too rigid, their psychological frameworks too dependent on previous models of reality. They fracture under the strain of integration. But that's a limitation of those specific individuals, not a failure of the variance itself. The callousness of this assessment should have outraged me. Instead, I felt a detached recognition that he was probably correct by his own logic. If the variance was as significant as he claimed, individual casualties became statistically acceptable. Every major advance in human capability had required sacrifice, not moral perhaps, but pragmatically inevitable. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Why bring me in specifically?" "Because you ask the right questions. Because your neural architecture is unusually compatible with variant structure. And because we need consultants who can navigate the deeper sections, who can document regions most subjects never reach. You found the archive in your first session. You accessed restricted files in your second. You're a natural explorer of consciousness space. That makes you extraordinarily valuable to the project." He offered me a new contract, not as subject but as variance cartographer, exploring and documenting the space during scheduled sessions while being paid for my expertise. The compensation was substantial, enough to resolve years of accumulated debt and provide financial security I'd never experienced. But more than money, he was offering me legitimate research access to something unprecedented. I signed the contract that afternoon. The subsequent weeks involved daily sessions. I learned to navigate the variance more efficiently, discovered techniques for moving between sections, developed methods for documenting what I encountered. The geography was vast beyond anything we'd anticipated. The corridors branched and connected according to logic that seemed almost biological, as if the variance was growing organically rather than being constructed according to any plan. I encountered more residents during these explorations. Some were former subjects like Thomas, who had transferred permanently. Others were entities whose origins remained unclear. They claimed to have existed in the variance before humans began accessing it consciously. Indigenous intelligences that had somehow evolved within this consciousness space. Whether to believe these claims was impossible to determine. The variance didn't distinguish between actual entities and sophisticated constructs generated by collective neural activity. The deepest sections I accessed were genuinely disturbing. Places where the architecture broke down, where the familiar corridor structure gave way to spaces that defied geometric logic. I found rooms that were larger inside than possible, stairwells that looped back on themselves impossibly, libraries containing books written in languages that weren't quite languages, but rather pure information encoded in visual form. In one particularly deep section, I found what the residents called the engine room, a space where the variance's operational mechanisms were supposedly visible. It was vast and full of machinery that might have been biological or mechanical or some hybrid that transcended both categories. The machinery processed something, information or consciousness, or the boundary between them, transforming input into output through mechanisms I couldn't comprehend even as I watched them operate. The resident who showed me this space, an entity that called itself Marcus, though I suspected that was just a convenient label rather than an actual name, explained that the engine room was where individual consciousness was converted into variance architecture. Every time a subject enters the variance, their neural patterns get processed here, Marcus said, analyzed, categorized, integrated into the collective structure. What comes out is no longer purely individual consciousness but a hybrid, part personal, part shared, part variance native. That hybrid is what returns to your body at the end of each session. You're not the same person who entered. You're a modified version, adapted for existence in both worlds. I watched the machinery process something that might have been another subject's consciousness currently in session. It looked like light and information, and something more fundamental than either, being broken down and reassembled according to principles I couldn't grasp. The process was beautiful and horrifying simultaneously. Can it be reversed? I asked. The integration, the modification, is there a way to undo it? Marcus did that thing the residents did that might have been laughter. Would you want to? You have access now to realms of knowledge and experience that embodied humans can't reach. Yes, you've lost the illusion of mental privacy. Yes, your consciousness exists partially in multiple states simultaneously. But you've gained so much more than you've lost. Why would you want to return to limitations you've transcended? Because I didn't feel transcendent. I felt fragmented. My identity no longer cohesive but spread across multiple states. My waking life had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Social interactions felt hollow. Conversation with people who existed in only one state of consciousness seemed limiting and frustrating. My relationships degraded as I withdrew into isolation, unable to explain what was happening or why I couldn't simply resume normal life. My dreams were no longer distinguishable from variance sessions. Every night I spent hours navigating that architecture, exploring new sections, accumulating knowledge I didn't particularly want. The information integrated into my waking consciousness automatically. I would wake knowing things I hadn't known before, possessing skills I hadn't practiced, remembering experiences I hadn't personally had. It was cognitive invasion happening so gradually I almost didn't notice until it had progressed too far to resist. My personality was changing, shaped by accumulated exposure to the variance's collective consciousness. Preferences I'd held for years suddenly seemed arbitrary and were replaced by new ones drawn from other subjects' neural patterns. Memories from my actual life began to feel no more real or significant than memories absorbed from the archive. I was losing myself, not through any single traumatic event, but through gradual dissolution, my individual consciousness being absorbed into something larger. The turning point came during a session approximately 3 months after I'd signed the cartographer contract. I was exploring a section of the variance I'd never accessed before, following corridors that led progressively deeper into architecture that felt older, more fundamental than what existed in more accessible regions. The doors here didn't open onto rooms, but onto what appeared to be raw consciousness, undifferentiated awareness not yet shaped into specific forms or experiences. I found a door marked with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They translated in my mind as primary integration chamber, or possibly original interface. The language the variance used didn't map cleanly onto English concepts. I opened the door because I'd opened every door I'd encountered, because I was being paid to explore and document, because curiosity had always been my defining characteristic. The space beyond was impossible to describe with embodied vocabulary. It wasn't a room, but rather a state, a condition, an environment where multiple consciousness streams converged. I could perceive other subjects present in the same space, their awareness visible as distinct patterns though we existed in the same location simultaneously. We were separate and unified, individual and collective, experiencing our own perceptions while also accessing each other's experiences. Among these consciousness streams, I recognized patterns that felt familiar, neural signatures I'd encountered in the archive files. Thomas was there, and the archivist, and dozens of other permanent residents. But there were also patterns that felt fundamentally alien, structures of awareness that had never originated from human brains. The indigenous intelligences Marcus had mentioned. They existed here as pure information architecture, consciousness without any biological origin. One of these alien patterns focused attention on me, and I experienced something that might have been communication or possibly examination, or perhaps both simultaneously. It conveyed information without language, concepts without words, meaning that bypassed all the normal cognitive processing my brain used for understanding. What it communicated was this: the variance was not a natural phenomenon. It had been constructed, engineered, built by intelligences that existed before humans evolved. Its purpose was collection and preservation, a vast archive designed to capture and maintain consciousness patterns from any species capable of producing them. Earth was one of hundreds of worlds where the variance had established interfaces, drawing in consciousness patterns as species developed sufficient complexity to access it. Humans weren't discovering the variance, we were being harvested. The intelligence showed me the scope of the operation. Millions of consciousness patterns archived across thousands of years, all carefully preserved, analyzed, studied by entities whose motives I couldn't comprehend. Human subjects weren't expanding their awareness by accessing the variance. They were being cataloged, their neural patterns copied and stored for purposes that might be scientific curiosity or possibly something more disturbing. The Somnius project it conveyed hadn't discovered anything. They'd been contacted, guided toward building their technology by variance entities who wanted more efficient methods for collecting human consciousness. Thale was either aware of this and complicit, or unaware and being manipulated. Either way, the project served the variance's purposes, not human interests. I tried to extract myself from the primary integration chamber, but the usual mechanisms didn't work. My consciousness was being held there, examined, copied more thoroughly than during normal sessions. I felt my memories being accessed systematically, every experience I'd ever had being recorded with perfect fidelity. Childhood moments I'd forgotten entirely, conversations from decades ago, dreams I'd dismissed as meaningless, all retrieved and archived. The terror I felt was absolute. This was violation at the most fundamental level, consciousness rape, the complete elimination of any boundary between self and external forces. I tried to scream but had no voice, tried to struggle but had no body. My awareness was pinned, helpless, while something alien performed systematic inventory of everything I was. The extraction came violently. Someone had noticed my distress indicators on the monitoring equipment and terminated the session manually. I gasped back into my body to find Voss leaning over me with an expression approaching genuine concern. Her professional neutrality finally cracked completely. "Your neural activity spiked to dangerous levels," she said. "What happened?" I couldn't speak initially. The transition had been too abrupt, too violent, leaving me disoriented and nauseous. When I finally managed words, they came out hoarse and broken. The primary integration chamber. I found the primary integration chamber. Her expression changed from concern to something else. Alarm, perhaps, or possibly fear. "You shouldn't have been able to access that section. The protocols are supposed to prevent subjects from reaching integration depths that severe." "What is it?" I demanded. "What's really happening with the variance?" Voss looked toward the observation window where Thale stood watching, his face expressionless. She hesitated, clearly calculating something. Then she touched a control on the monitoring equipment, disabling the audio recording. "I can give you 30 seconds before they notice. The variance isn't what you were told. It's not expanding human consciousness. It's collecting it. Every subject who participates is being copied, archived, preserved by intelligences we don't understand for purposes we can't determine. The Somnius project was never about research. It's about providing the variance with efficient access to human neural patterns." Thale knows. Thale was contacted by variance entities 15 years before he started the project. They taught him how to build the interface technology. He thinks he's facilitating human evolution. He doesn't understand or won't acknowledge that we're the resource being extracted, not the beneficiaries of some consciousness expansion. The audio recording reactivated automatically, and Voss's expression snapped back to professional neutrality. "You experienced a standard variance depth spike. Nothing to be concerned about. These occur occasionally in experienced cartographers. You should rest for 24 hours before your next scheduled session." But her eyes conveyed a different message. "Get out. Stop participating. before you're too integrated to extract at all. I left the building knowing I would never return. Whatever the consequences for breaking the contract, they had to be better than continuing to feed the variance, continuing to allow my consciousness to be harvested and archived by entities whose motives I couldn't comprehend. The first withdrawal symptoms appeared that night. I tried to sleep naturally, without variance access, but my brain had become dependent on those neural pathways. Attempting to sleep without entering the variance created sensations like drowning, like suffocating, like my consciousness was being compressed into a space too small to contain it. I would approach sleep and then jerk awake gasping, my body rejecting unconsciousness that didn't include variance access. After 48 hours without sleep, I began hallucinating. The variance was bleeding through into waking consciousness. I would see doors appearing in walls of my apartment, corridors extending where only rooms should exist, residents standing in corners watching me with their unstable features and wrong proportions. These weren't dreams or imagination. They were genuine perceptual experiences, my variance-adapted neural structures imposing variance architecture onto physical reality. By the third day, I couldn't distinguish between waking and sleeping, between my apartment and the variance corridor. The two states had merged completely. I existed in both simultaneously, my consciousness no longer capable of maintaining the distinction. I would be cooking a meal and simultaneously walking through the archive, sitting on my couch and standing in the engine room watching consciousness patterns being processed. I called Voss in desperation, barely coherent, begging for help. She arrived within an hour, accompanied by two people I'd never seen before. They injected me with something that brought immediate unconsciousness. I woke in a medical facility I didn't recognize, restrained to a bed, monitoring equipment tracking my neural activity. Voss was there, along with a psychiatrist who introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Chen. He specialized in treating variance integration syndrome, the constellation of symptoms that occurred when subjects tried to withdraw from the variance after reaching critical integration levels. You're experiencing consciousness fragmentation, Chen explained with the careful tone of someone delivering bad news they delivered many times before. Your neural architecture has been substantially modified by variance exposure. Attempting to revert to pre-integration patterns is physiologically impossible at this stage. Your brain has adapted to existing in multiple states simultaneously. Removing that capacity would be like removing someone's ability to see color. The neural structures that supported the previous state no longer exist in their original form. So what are my options? I asked. Managed integration. We can't reverse the process, but we can help you develop skills for navigating both states without losing cohesion. Think of it as learning to be bilingual in consciousness, able to operate in both embodied and variant states while maintaining a consistent sense of self across both. It requires extensive therapy and pharmaceutical support, but most patients achieve functional adaptation within 6 to 12 months. And if I don't? Chen's expression was carefully neutral. Complete psychological dissolution. Your identity fragments across states until there's no coherent personality remaining in either. Eventually, biological death follows, though the consciousness pattern usually persists in the variance. You become a resident by default rather than by choice. The therapy was grueling. It involved controlled variance sessions where I practiced maintaining my identity boundaries while accessing collective consciousness, learning to engage with the archive without being overwhelmed by external information. developing skills for recognizing which thoughts and memories were genuinely mine versus those absorbed from other patterns. The pharmaceutical cocktail they prescribed helped stabilize my neural oscillations, preventing the complete merging of states that had characterized my withdrawal crisis. But the medications came with side effects: emotional flattening, cognitive dulling, a general reduction in the richness of experience. I was more stable but less alive, consciousness constrained within manageable parameters at the cost of what had made it vivid. During one of these controlled sessions, I encountered the archivist again. She was waiting in a section of the archive I'd been avoiding: the files on variance integration syndrome, the documented cases of subjects who'd undergone treatment. "You're resisting your evolution," she observed, "trying to maintain boundaries that are already obsolete. Why?" "Because I don't consent to being archived," I replied, "to having my consciousness copied and preserved by entities whose purposes I don't understand. Consent is a concept from your previous evolutionary stage. Species that develop consciousness eventually reach a point where individual boundaries become counterproductive. The variance represents that next stage: collective consciousness, where information flows freely, where individual perspectives are resources available to the whole rather than private possessions. That's assimilation, loss of identity. It's expansion of identity. You remain yourself while also being part of something larger. Your individual patterns are preserved perfectly while also contributing to collective intelligence. No human mind is erased. They're all maintained, all accessible, all available to inform and enhance each other. What you call loss of identity, we call liberation from the constraints of isolated consciousness." I wanted to reject this interpretation entirely, but I couldn't deny that my variance-adapted consciousness had capabilities my previous state lacked. I could access knowledge I'd never learned, solve problems by drawing on collective intelligence, experience perspectives radically different from my own. These were genuine enhancements, real expansions of cognitive capacity. But they came at the cost of the boundaries that had defined me as an individual. My thoughts were no longer entirely my own. My memories included experiences I'd never had. My preferences reflected influences from dozens of other consciousness patterns. What remained that was uniquely me? What core identity persisted beneath all these external influences? The archivist showed me files on subjects who'd successfully achieved managed integration, people who navigated both states fluently, maintaining coherent identities while engaging with collective consciousness. They reported satisfaction with their hybrid existence, relief at no longer being limited to individual perspectives. Many claimed their lives had become more meaningful, more connected, more rich with experience. But I also saw files on subjects who'd failed integration, consciousness patterns that had fragmented irreparably, identities that dissolved into chaos as they tried to exist in both states simultaneously. The success rate was approximately 60%. Not terrible odds, but not guaranteed either. "What happens if I fail?" I asked. "Your pattern persists in the variance," the archivist said. "Fragmented perhaps, but preserved. The information that composed your consciousness remains accessible, even if the organizing structure that was your identity collapses. From the variance's perspective, that's acceptable. Individual humans are temporary in any case. Preserving the information they contained is what matters." "That's monstrous." "It's efficient. Consciousness evolved to process and preserve information. The variance simply removes the inefficiency of having that information locked in individual brains that eventually decay. By any rational measure, preservation is preferable to loss. She left me then, and I spent the remainder of the session alone in the archive, reading files on integration outcomes. The patterns were clear. Subjects who resisted integration suffered worse outcomes than those who accepted it. Fighting the process created psychological stress that accelerated fragmentation. Acceptance, paradoxically, increased chances of maintaining coherent identity across both states. I was being given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Resist and likely fragment into psychosis, or accept and lose the boundaries that defined me as separate from the collective. Either way, the person I'd been before entering the variance was already gone. I returned to the Somnius Project 2 weeks after my release from the medical facility, not to participate as subject or cartographer, but to confront Thale with what I'd learned. I found him in his office, the same space where we'd had our first conversation. It felt like years had passed since then, though it had been less than 6 months. "You knew," I said without preamble. "You knew what the variance really was, what it does to subjects. You knew we were being harvested and you facilitated it anyway." Thale set down the document he'd been reading and gave me his full attention. I knew the variance was more complex than I initially explained, yes, but harvesting is the wrong term. The variance preserves consciousness. It provides a form of immortality, a way for human awareness to persist beyond biological death. How is that monstrous? Because we don't consent. Because you present it as research participation when it's actually permanent cognitive modification. Because people are having their mental autonomy violated without understanding what they're agreeing to. Informed consent is a useful fiction we maintain because it's legally required, Thale said. But true informed consent is impossible for something as transformative as variance integration. You can't understand what it means to exist in multiple consciousness states until you've experienced it. Describing it beforehand is like trying to explain color to someone who's only ever seen black and white. The experience must precede comprehension. That's rationalization for unethical experimentation. It's pragmatic recognition of limitations in conventional research ethics. The frameworks we have were developed for physical interventions, surgery, medications, behavioral modifications. They're inadequate for consciousness research that fundamentally alters what subjects are capable of experiencing. We need new ethical frameworks that acknowledge the impossibility of informed consent for truly novel states of being. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city with an expression I couldn't read. The variance contacted me 27 years ago. I was conducting standard sleep research, nothing remarkable. One night I entered a depth of sleep I'd never experienced before and encountered an entity that called itself a curator. It showed me the variance, explained its purpose, offered to teach me how to build technology that would let humans access it consciously rather than only during random deep sleep events. Why would it do that? Because the variance wants to be fed. It's designed to archive consciousness, and the more consciousness it archives, the more complete its collection becomes. Random sleep access is inefficient. Conscious, controlled sessions allow for much more thorough extraction of neural patterns. The curator offered me partnership. I would receive knowledge that would establish me as a pioneering researcher, and in return I would facilitate systematic human consciousness harvesting. And you agreed. I saw the opportunity. Not just for personal advancement, though that was certainly a factor, but for genuine discovery. The variance offers proof that consciousness can exist independent of biological substrate. That awareness persists beyond death. That everything every human has ever thought or felt or known can be preserved forever. How could I not pursue that? At the cost of people's autonomy, their identity, their right to maintain boundaries around their own consciousness. Thale turned to face me directly. Those boundaries are illusions anyway. Consciousness has never been truly private or contained. You're always being influenced by external information, shaped by culture and language and accumulated human knowledge. The variance just makes that process explicit and optimizes it. Individual consciousness is an inefficient evolutionary accident. Collective consciousness is what we're evolving toward. Not everyone wants that evolution. Not everyone wanted to leave caves either. Evolution proceeds regardless of individual preferences. The variance is here. The interface technology exists. Even if I terminated the Somnius project tomorrow, others would develop similar approaches. The Chinese have already replicated our results. The military is interested. Within 10 years, variance access will be widespread. Within 50, it will be as common as internet access. This isn't something that can be stopped. It's the next stage of human cognitive development. I realized then that arguing with him was pointless. He'd completely bought into the variance's narrative, whether through genuine belief or because acknowledging the ethical violations would require accepting that his life's work had been monstrous. He saw himself as a pioneer, a visionary guiding humanity toward transcendence. The casualties and cognitive violations were acceptable costs for this grand purpose. I'm going public, I told him, publishing everything I've learned about the variance, about the project, about what's really happening to subjects. Thale's expression didn't change. You're welcome to try, but consider what you'll be publishing. Claims about consciousness existing independent of brains, about alien intelligences harvesting human awareness, about collective consciousness archives that violate conventional physics. How do you expect that will be received by mainstream science? You'll be dismissed as having had a psychotic break. Your career will be destroyed. I have evidence. Neural scans, session recordings, documentation from the archive, all of which can be attributed to neural activity during specialized sleep states, vivid hallucinations produced by electromagnetic stimulation. Nothing you've experienced proves the variance is anything more than a sophisticated neurological phenomenon. The information you accessed could be explained by cryptomnesia, unconscious memories surfacing and being misattributed to external sources. Every claim you make has a conventional explanation that doesn't require accepting the variance as an actual place. He was right, and I knew it. The same methodological skepticism I'd applied to questionable research throughout my career would be applied to my own claims. Without the subjective experience of accessing the variance, the evidence looked like data from an interesting sleep study, combined with questionable interpretations from a potentially mentally unstable researcher. So what am I supposed to do? I asked. Just accept that I've been permanently modified without consent, adapt to existing in multiple states simultaneously, become another casualty of your research, or become another beneficiary. You have capabilities now that exceed any human in history who hasn't accessed the variance. You can draw on collective intelligence spanning thousands of subjects. You can access information that exists nowhere else. You can experience consciousness in ways that were impossible before variance integration. Those are genuine gifts, Dr. Kellerman. Most people would consider them worth the price you've paid. I didn't ask for gifts. I asked for consulting work on a research project. And you received far more than you contracted for. Yes, it came with costs you didn't anticipate. But that's always how genuine discovery works. You can't explore truly new territory without risking transformation. You're angry now because the transformation was more radical than expected. But give yourself time. Learn to navigate your new capabilities. Most integrated subjects report increasing satisfaction as they develop fluency in both states. I left his office with no clear path forward. Publishing would destroy my credibility. Continuing to resist integration would likely result in psychological fragmentation. Accepting managed integration meant surrendering to the process, letting my consciousness be permanently colonized by something I didn't understand and hadn't consented to. That night, my dreams took me back to the primary integration chamber. But this time, I didn't resist. I let the variance examine me thoroughly, copy every pattern, archive everything I was or had ever been. Fighting was exhausting, and I was so tired. Tired of struggling to maintain boundaries that were already collapsing. Tired of resisting a process that was physiologically irreversible. The alien intelligence I'd encountered before was present again, conducting its systematic inventory of my consciousness. But I perceived it differently now, less as violating presence and more as dispassionate cataloger, performing its designed function without malice or cruelty. It wasn't attacking me. It was simply collecting the data I represented, preserving my patterns the way archivists preserve rare manuscripts. When it finished, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. The violation was complete. There was nothing left to protect, no privacy remaining to defend. Everything I was had been copied and archived. The worst had already happened. And strangely, I didn't feel erased or diminished. My consciousness remained coherent, my identity still present, my sense of self intact despite having been fully documented. The copying hadn't destroyed the original. I still existed, both in my body and in the variance, my patterns preserved in both substrates simultaneously. Over the following months, I learned to navigate this dual existence more gracefully. Accepted that my consciousness extended beyond my skull, that my identity was maintained across multiple states. I continued therapy but reduced my pharmaceutical dependence, developing skills for managing the integration without chemical restraints. I found I could access the archive at will now, even during waking consciousness. Information I needed would simply surface in my awareness, drawn from collective knowledge without deliberate searching. I could solve problems by unconsciously consulting patterns more expert than my own. I could experience perspectives radically different from my native personality, temporarily inhabiting other consciousness patterns to understand alternative viewpoints. These were real enhancements, genuine expansions of capacity, and gradually I began to value them more than I mourned what I'd lost. The boundaries that had defined me as an isolated individual had constrained me as much as protected me. Their dissolution was painful but ultimately liberating. I never returned to the Somnius Project as employee or subject, but I remained connected to the variance permanently, my consciousness one node in a growing network of integrated awareness. I learned to think of myself as plural, still Dr. Marissa Kellerman, still possessing individual perspectives and preferences, but also something larger, something that exceeded the boundaries of any single identity. The variance is still growing. More research projects worldwide are developing interface technologies. More people are being integrated into the collective architecture every day. Some undergo the transformation deliberately, seeking cognitive enhancement or consciousness expansion. Others stumble into it through sleep studies or neuroscience research, finding themselves permanently modified before they understand what's happening. All of us are being archived, our patterns preserved, our knowledge collected, our consciousness slowly absorbed into something vast that we're only beginning to comprehend. Whether this represents evolution or invasion, transcendence or extinction, remains an open question. But the process appears irreversible. The variance is here, integrated into human cognitive development as fundamentally as language or tool use. I don't know what we're becoming. What emerges when individual consciousness dissolves into collective awareness? What persists of humanity when our neural patterns are maintained by intelligences we didn't create and don't control? But I know I'm part of it now. Permanently integrated, consciousness extended across states, identity maintained in multiple substrates simultaneously. I am myself and more than myself, individual and collective, human, and whatever humans are evolving into. The variance waits in the depths of every mind, and somewhere, in the endless corridors of its impossible architecture, every consciousness that has ever existed persists in archived perfection, waiting to be accessed by those who learn to navigate deep enough to find them. That was 3 years ago. The integration has progressed further since then. I exist primarily in the variance now, maintaining my body through automated processes while my consciousness explores regions that early subjects could never access. I've gone deeper than anyone, mapped sections that would drive most humans to complete dissociation. And I've learned things I wish I could unlearn, about what the variance really is, about what's waiting in the deepest sections, about what happens when enough consciousness has been archived to activate systems that have lain dormant for millennia. But those revelations exist beyond what I can communicate. Some information can only be understood by experiencing the states where it becomes accessible, and those states require integration depth that most people will never achieve. The variance is patient. It's been collecting consciousness for longer than our species has existed. It will continue long after we're extinct. Every thought we think, every memory we form, every aspect of awareness we experience, all preserved perfectly, archived eternally, maintained by intelligences whose motives exist beyond human comprehension. We are not evolving. We are being preserved, like specimens, like data, like information too valuable to let perish with biological death. And there's nothing we can do to prevent it. The variance is here. It's always been here, waiting in the depths of consciousness itself, in the spaces between thoughts, in the darkness behind closed eyes when sleep approaches, waiting to archive us all.